Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. Friends, in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the ethical imperative for leaders with Andrew Cooper. I have to share with you, I think so often those of us that have intentionally been leaders in the nonprofit sector don't think enough about the ethics of our leadership, how we do what we do, and why we do what we do. So we're going to have sort of a dive into philosophy and ethics today with Andrew Cooper. Andrew is a globally recognized executive leader and advocate for compassionate practices in leadership. He made history as the first millennial and Black executive to serve as general counsel of UPS Airlines. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, UPS has an airlines? Why, yes, they do. And you may not know this, but they are the world's largest logistics airline operating in 220 countries with over 20,000 employees. Friends, I think you know that I say this a lot on the podcast because I'm a consultant, I travel a lot, and I cannot tell you how many times I've been on a Delta jet and I look out the window and I'm like, oh, there's a UPS jet. It's one of the things about being in Atlanta. Both companies are headquartered there, and I bet a lot of jets roll through Hartsfield. Now, just so you know, Cooper's team at UPS Airline played a pivotal role in the success of an operation that was critically important in all of our lives, and that's Operation Warp Speed, the United States effort to get the pandemic COVID vaccine out across the country as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Since leaving the airline, he has remained committed to facilitating leadership transformation, and he does this now by assisting organizations in achieving and sustaining high performance. He has a new book out. It was published by Wiley, and it's called The Ethical Imperative. And when you read his debut book, you can clearly see that he cares passionately about reversing course on wealth inequality, economic decay, and climate change. And friends, you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, I'm in the nonprofit sector. Of course, I'm committed to reversing all of these things as well. Why are you having Andrew on? Well, while his book is clearly primarily written for for-profit companies and leaders, it is just as important for us in the nonprofit sector because we in the sector are the holders of public trust. And the same way that the public has lost a lot of trust in for-profit companies, we also have seen that the public has lost a lot of trust in nonprofit organizations. It's one of the reasons, and by the way, even us as leaders will do this, put industrial complex at the end of our cause. So we might call it the poverty industrial complex, the arts industrial complex, the homeless industrial complex. When people say that, that's also kind of saying, yeah, maybe I think the system is a little too big to be trusted. So that's why I was so excited when Andrew reached out and suggested coming on the podcast. Hey, Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I've been excited to get on the podcast with you.
Well, Andrew, I have to share with you, I loved reading your book. I especially like the way you weaved your personal stories, literally from the earliest memories in your life to today into this book. But talk to me about why you wrote the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote this book to give voice to the frequently overlooked person within our organizations, and those are the emerging leaders. You see, when I started at UPS Airlines in 2018, I had no idea that the pandemic and social unrest would be challenges. And they asked me, the president of the airline asked me to take on the role of executive sponsor to our young professionals and millennials BRG. These individuals are the youngest among us, but they are steadily gaining experience. And I was tasked with bringing their concerns to senior leaders. And what I realized is that senior leaders, they have something to say to them. And my hope is to give voice to some of those concerns in this book.
So I just want to level set. I think many folks who are listening know what a BRG is, but can you just quickly share what that is?
Absolutely. A business resource group, sometimes called ERGs or employee resource groups, but they tend to be the collection of various ethnic groups or religious groups, people with shared beliefs that come together to support each other and socialize inside organizational contexts, most often in large, complex organizations.
And I'll also say it's been my experience that they also are good places for organizing and pushing for change. And so, like a lot of companies have LGBTQ plus BRGs, and sometimes they're called ERGs, employee resource groups, where they're inside that company pushing for change.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll share with you, Andrew, there were some things that really stood out for me in your book, and I'm hoping we can talk about some of them. One of them is kind of this radical idea. You call it a tithe, and I'm going to call it an extra 20% for human capital investment.
Yeah. So, as you will notice in the book, I have a lot of my principles from my upbringing engaged in the book. And one of those principles is this idea of tithing. So, I come from a conservative, traditional family in South Carolina. My father was a minister. But when I was coming up, that idea always stuck with me, this idea that of everything that you take in, there's something that should be given, that should be sown, that should be invested back in the organizations and in the communities that you're a part of. And I think often as corporate leaders, we believe that we're somewhat removed from the idea of giving back. And we're not. The message from the young people in the Millennials BRG that I was the executive sponsor of is that we want to see more from the company when it comes to things like climate change, when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to all of these issues that we care about, issues that your listeners know very well because they are engaged in doing that good work every single day. For some reason, principally since the 1970s, according to my research, organizations shifted from community-based organizations that were really focused, and I'm talking for-profit companies that were focused on building communities. When you think of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and what the company Hershey did in that community, when you think of Bentonville, Arkansas, and how Walmart turned that community around, when you think about Coca-Cola in Atlanta, companies really were dedicated to communities. So the idea of the tithe is that every dollar of revenue that's brought in, the company needs to be setting aside, or your organization should be setting aside a bit of that in order to focus on issues that matter to the community that you're a part of. And so one of the examples from the book that I talk about a bit is Chick-fil-A. Now, Chick-fil-A, and I use them opposite Nike. They both have their own lanes, but Chick-fil-A does something incredibly well. And that's they focus on the southern part of Atlanta, the part of the city that is the most needing of educational resources, the most deserving of having corporate sponsorship. And they really dive in, going so far as to identify places where they can roll up their sleeves and fix homes, resod yards, or even just deliver a warm meal to a family in need. These are the types of things that organizations, for profit, nonprofit, need to be focused on in this new environment.
So it's interesting you say that. I also seem to recall, you and I both live in Metro Atlanta, that when Chick-fil-A started, and it started in Metro Atlanta, it started south of I-20. So it started in the southern part of the metro. So it also makes sense that they say, okay, we're going to be dedicated to where we started.
That's right. That's right.
I will share with you, I tried to think about some ways nonprofits could use that concept and that model, because as you know, oftentimes when I read books like this, I'm like, okay, how do we apply this to the nonprofit sector? And one of the things that I think about, gosh, this is 4 or 5 or 6 years ago, we had the author of Lead True on the podcast, and he was the retired chief executive of a large healthcare system in Wisconsin, not in a big city, but still a large healthcare system. So, $250 million budget kind of a healthcare system. Friends, I know you're looking at me going, Dolph, I have a $250 million budget, not a $250 million budget. Okay, that's all right. There's ways you could do similar things. But he actually challenged the board of directors to take half of their endowment and invest it in businesses in their community, because, nonprofits are allowed to invest their endowment in essentially investments that hopefully will create a return that will pay money back to the endowment and help it grow. And his argument was, yes, some of these businesses are going to go out of business, but if we're not investing in the community businesses around us, then we're not really committed to addressing those social disparities that cause people to come to the emergency room and end up getting checked into the hospital in the first place.
No, it's such a great point. And when I was writing this book, there's a chapter where we talk about how poverty, once it gets ingrained in a community has all of these negative externalities. I was going back and forth with the publisher about how deep we should go into this topic, but it ultimately made the cut where there are several studies from researchers that talk about how the externalities that result from poverty ultimately make business harder. It destabilizes the community in a broad way. So even nonprofits have a harder time of doing what they need to do when a community is destabilized. And what most nonprofits are focused on is some aspect of the human condition that needs to be improved. So it's actually a cascading impact. And so it makes sense that even from a nonprofit perspective, if you are operating in a low income community, to look beyond just what the mission is, the specific offerings that are on the table, be it youth education or counseling or mental health services, but to go beyond that and say, okay, where are the ways, the places where we can lean in and structurally support the community to provide that, what I call subjacent lateral support. So it could be, we need bus stops in order to get people to the services that we're providing, or we need shelters for people so that we can do the counseling. So there are other ways to think about the mission, and part of being an ethical leader is thinking about those ancillary impacts.
One of the other things you talk about, and I think it's in that chapter, and you do it really powerfully because you talk about having just moved to Kentucky for work, and you have a newborn, and you decide to order food from Uber Eats, and you're surprised by the driver. Can you talk about that?
My wife and I, we moved to Louisville, Kentucky, just to set the scene. I'm a brand new executive. I'm taking over this large organization, and my wife is unable to do all the meal prep and everything. So I'm like, I'm going to step in. I'm going to help. And of course, that ends up being me ordering lots and lots of Uber Eats. So I order Uber one day, and this gentleman arrives, and he's delivering my food. We just strike up a conversation, and he tells me he's an employee at one of the nearby organizations, corporate companies, and he's in high tech. He's got a lot of education, and I'm surprised that he's doing this Uber Eats thing. And so, the conversation goes into, well, why are you doing this? And he says, well, I've got a daughter that's going to school. I need to pay for that. I've got these other things that I need to pay for. What I'm making at the office is just not enough. And that really got me thinking, because even at that time, with a newborn child, new home, I'm thinking about, man, I might need to get a gig myself. And the truth is that there are a lot of our people who are out in organizations doing moonlighting, doing second jobs, because we have not put the resources to supporting them like we should. And so the goal of that particular part of the book is to encourage leaders who are thinking ethically about how they compensate individuals, how they support their employees, to think it through all of the things that may be impacting their lives, up to and including colleges, and how that should play out in benefits packages and assistance to scholarship funds and things like that. I honestly think there is a big opportunity right now in America when it comes to education policy for corporations to really lean in on an aspect of higher education for their employees, not just for their employees, but also their employees' families, or to even work with nonprofits in this space to help make college more affordable. And that's to really rejigger how benefits packages are paid, or how employees are able to put money away for education. So there's a lot of fertile ground there.
A couple things I just want to note, Andrew. I think moonlighting out of necessity is even more common in the nonprofit sector than it is in the for-profit middle management executive sector. I cannot tell you how many people I know in the nonprofit sector with director in their names that have another job.
I didn't know that. That is news to me. Wow. And look, on the one hand, I understand that, because nonprofits are often working under extreme economic, circumstances, not all of them, some of them. And so I get it may be hard to compensate employees in specific ways, but it is no excuse to do everything that we possibly can to ensure that employees are paid well. And I'll give a shout out just to two nonprofits that I support. The Lincoln Foundation. So I'll shout out my dear friend, Dr. Marshall Bradley in Louisville, Kentucky. I was on the board there for several years, and their focus is educational enrichment programs. And then also to my dear friend, Fifi Handy at Page Turners Make Great Learners here in Atlanta, that they're looking to close the velocity gap in literacy. But both organizations, they have great goals around literacy and education, but very different in their funding and support, right? So the Lincoln Foundation, very established, institutional, large, big portfolio of assets that can, cover costs of its staff and so on. And then Page Turners, not as well resourced, needs a working board, needs lots of help. So I would not expect the same thing of Page Turners as I would of the Lincoln Foundation, but the ethical leader will always be putting their people and their circumstances first.
And I will share with you, Andrew, I also think it's a little bit of a catch-22 because I hear you say, nonprofits are in a more resource-constrained environment. But so often as nonprofits, our funders look at us and say, well, are you hiring people from within your community? And then the funders turn around and say, but we also want you to pay 80% of what they could make somewhere else and don't give good benefits. And that's where I think as an ethical leader, we have to have those conversations with our funders. We have to say, well, you're saying it's important that we hire from within the community we serve, but you don't want us to be offering any kind of child care benefit. And you talk about this in your book. Don't you know child care could cost $20,000 a year for someone who you also think we should only be paying $30,000 a year. So after taxes, you're essentially saying someone should come work for us for free, or maybe actually lose money.
That's spot on, right? And this actually it heightens the challenge for funders, because if you are so-called engaged in doing good work, then you should be willing to fund that good work fully. And that includes paying for the talent and providing the benefits and support necessary in order for that good work to be done. The conversation must be had, and it has to be had obviously tactfully, because the funders is bringing, dollars to the table, but it's really a moral conversation. And that's where I think you can really lean in and have candid feedback for the funding that is available, because you can make a moral argument that your staff needs childcare. You can make a moral argument that your staff needs benefits, and that moral argument supports the goal and the mission of the organization. So let me just take one half step back and talk about, this concept of what it means to be conscientious. So in the book, I use the idea of the conscientious executive as a archetypal leader who most organizations need to promote. Now, that word conscientious comes from the Latin root conscientia. It means knowledge of oneself. It also means having a sense of right, a moral sense. And it is linked to the word conscience. They come from the same root. But the term gets at a normative question. Should we? And so for organizations that are looking to be conscientious, there's really two prisms of that pursuit. There's the why we should do a thing prism, and then there's the how we should do a thing prism. And for funders and executive directors and staff of organizations, you should be talking to each other on both of those prisms. When you're talking about benefits, hey, let's talk about the why. And then we can talk about the how, and doing the how in a way that satisfies the why.
I could not agree with you more. I also think so often with the how, honestly, we just need to kind of draw a line with our funders and say, we will only offer jobs that are good jobs. And if you're not willing to fund this, sorry, we might not be the right organization to take your money. And it's interesting. I've only had a handful of conversations like that with funders, and it's often eye-opening for me the way in which funders respond. Typically funders have not said, you are out of your mind. We are never giving you another dollar. Now, I may not get everything I ask for, but it's interesting because that actually opens up a dialogue where we start to talk about, okay, well, what's important to you? And one of the questions I love to ask, especially foundations, benefits do you all get?
Mm.
And what level of benefit should we be providing based on the level of benefit that you and your governing board believes staff should have?
But you see how much more rich that conversation is. Now we're having a conversation about where our principles are as funders and as an organization. And if I'm sitting on the board and I'm having that kind of conversation, we can now align on what we believe. And if we are aligned, we will come generally to a consensus point of view that we can both accept. And if we don't, then perhaps we have slightly different beliefs. And to your point, maybe a different organization is a better fit.
Yeah. Let me also just say early on in my career, I did not understand that well enough. And like I will always remember, this is almost 30 years ago, back when I was a baby fundraiser, and I actually was not in a place where I could have made the call within the organization. But even if I had been, I would not have done something different back then from what the organization did. We had an incredible individual donor with a significant amount of personal wealth, self-made person. But one day, it was the middle of the summer, at a well-known senior high-rise, the entire AC system broke. And the donor called us up, and of course it made the paper. Let me back up. Of course, it made the paper, and the paper was saying, this is a complicated system. They now have to go and get a loan to put in a new system, and seniors might be without AC for 2 weeks. And of course, temperatures soaring into the 90s. So the donor calls us up and says, I'd like to buy a fan for every apartment in that building. I need you all to coordinate it. Tell me how much it is. I'll pay for it. And then make sure every apartment actually gets a fan. And of course, this donor did not want to pay for a penny of staff. So somehow all that coordination was just going to happen magically.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. It's frustrating. It's frustrating because the goal is a great goal. It's a laudable goal, right? But then it's also, these things don't just happen.
And I'll share with you what we ended up doing was we ended up going to another donor and said, okay, we have this generous offer, but they're not willing to pay for staff. Will you pay X amount for coordination? And that donor, thankfully, was willing to do it. But the lost opportunity was to try to educate the original donor and help that person understand, for every fan we distribute, we spend $5 coordinating that distribution. Can you give us that money too? Andrew, there's one other thing from your book I really wanted to make sure we talked about, because I know it is something that a lot of us who are nonprofit leaders struggle with. I'm going to use the term that you use, and then we can talk about it. In the book, you call it maximization default.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea goes that by default, we should be looking to achieve maximal results. And that's under any circumstance. Sometimes the circumstances are suboptimal. Sometimes they may not be what we anticipate them to be, but we have to make it a cultural norm that the areas where we can lean in are where we lean in. The idea is that we focus on efficiency, really. So going back briefly to the why and the how. So we're focusing on efficiency for the benefit of people. Essentially, we find efficiency for employee comfort rather than margin, or we find efficiencies for the purposes of the targets of our efforts, the homeless, the sick, the shut in. They could be customers, but it's not efficiency for efficiency's sake. It's efficiency because we know downstream there is someone that will benefit from it. And what makes this really hard for some organizations is that it means you may have to sacrifice things that you want to do. I think, the example of Clorox in the book. I think that one made the cut, and we talk about how Clorox had to remove a bunch of SKUs from its inventory. It wanted to sell lots and lots and lots of things. But in order to accomplish some of the objectives the board set out, they realized, hey, we're not going to be able to actually support all of these various lines. And so part of it is making those hard decisions, and those hard decisions, which are the how, should be linked as closely as possible to the people who are the why, who will be getting the benefit. At UPS Airlines, at my team, my job during COVID, seeing how efficient they were working, but knowing that we would be in a resource constrained environment, was to give them, as my team, as much power in decision making as possible, so that they could, knowing that the goal was to maximize our efforts, to give them as much power as possible, and then to watch the magic happen. And sometimes that's what you have to do, is strip away some of the layers of bureaucracy, strip away some of the bells and whistles that you're accustomed to, and really rolling up your sleeves and getting down into the weed, into the mud. I grew up in a single wide trailer on a dirt road, so actually rolling up my sleeves and knowing that I wouldn't get more head count, and I'd have to get shoulder to shoulder with the people doing the work, was something that I was accustomed to. And unfortunately, lots of leaders are not accustomed to that today. But those leaders who are conscientious leaders will use this maximization default as a superpower rather than an unfortunate result of being in a resource constrained environment.
Andrew, the one thing I want to add to that is, as I was reading that, I also kept having this thought that it's kind of like mowing the lawn. So, if I go out and mow my lawn, okay, it looks great. Everything's exactly the way it should be. But 10 days later, I have to mow it again. And I think the same thing happens when we're like, okay, what do we need to strip away? Because over time, more things get added on. Oh, let's do this. Let's add this process. And before you know it, you need to mow the lawn again. You need to go back through and say, okay, what do we strip away?
Absolutely. You've got to declutter, right? You don't pile on more complexity than is necessary, right? Focusing on the important work is how you maximize by default. I mean, that is the real key. And oftentimes we have these grand designs. We've got these strategic maps, roadmaps, and we've got all of these things that we want to do. We've thought about it A to Z, and then life happens. A grant doesn't come through, a funder dies, the children have different priorities, something happens that will destroy that roadmap, right? And so the art of reformulating and taking out the noise and getting back to fundamentals, those things are key kind of for the next generation of leaders in organizations, for profit as well as nonprofit organizations.
So, Andrew, one of the things I love about doing this podcast is I get to read lots of great books like yours. And as a guest, I had the author of How Big Things Get Done on about 6 or 12 months ago. And one of the things I love that he says is, as humans, we have an addition bias when what we need is a deletion bias. Like, what am I not going to do so that I can achieve the result that I want? As opposed to what 5 additional things should I do so I can achieve the result that I want?
No, I love it. And I completely agree. The nice thing about being in this leadership space is that there are a lot of people writing about the same similar issues, and they are coming to consensus. And I certainly agree that, especially where I sit in a Silicon Valley based company, highly matrixed, lots of people, that we tend to want to add as much as possible when sometimes the right move is to prune.
Yeah. And friends, I know you might be sitting back right now thinking, Dolph always seems to think about other books when he's talking to authors. Don't worry. I promise you, Andrew's book, The Ethical Imperative, is going to come up in future episodes, because now that I've read it, it's just kind of parts of it are in my brain and it's going to pop at some part in a conversation. Well, Andrew, I'm glad you've joined us, and I also want to play a game with you. I would love to play 2 truths and a lie with you. And I hope you will share 3 quote unquote facts about yourself with me. One of them will not be true. The other 2 will be true. And I'll get to guess which one is a lie.
Well, this is a great game. Since you've read the book, the one truth that came to mind, I'm not going to use because you'll know.
Admittedly, you did weave so many personal things in that I remember thinking I might have an unfair advantage. now,
yeah.
now watch me still get it wrong. Hubris.
All right. So I am a great skier. I run a small business, and my first vehicle was a G37S convertible.
Okay. I know you run a small business. At least I believe you run a small business. The first vehicle one, that's tough. That's really tough. I know you learned how to drive, I think, on an F-150. I don't know if that ended up becoming your first vehicle. So I'm going to guess and I only know that from your book. So I'm going to guess that F-150 became your first vehicle. And so the convertible was not your first vehicle.
Oh, good. That was excellent. Yeah, you're
Okay.
right.
Well, like I said, as I was reading your book, I'm like, oh yeah, he discloses so much about himself. I'm like, I might actually be able to do this one pretty well.
Yeah, no, you were spot on.
And,
Wow.
and if I recall, this is something you and I have in common. Well, I did not learn how to drive in a truck. I actually learned how to drive I think it was a 1971 or 72 Valiant, but
Yeah.
it was a stick. So I did learn how to drive on a stick, which every now and then has come in handy. There's some countries where when you go to the rental counter, that's all they have are
Yeah.
manual transmissions.
Well, like writing cursive, our kids will never know what we're talking about, right? So apparently they don't teach cursive in school, and by the time my daughter is 18, I think stick shifts will be a thing of the past. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know.
I agree with you on that, but I'm going to share a futurist prediction. By the time your daughter has children and they're old enough to drive, no one will drive anymore.
Yeah. I don't think that is crazy. With some of the technology that I see being rolled out, it's very possible.
Yeah, and by the way, and that's our lifetime. At least I think that's why. I mean, unless I die tragically young, I'm only 53. That's our lifetime. Like we'll probably reach a world where no one drives anymore. Anyway, so that's my prediction. We're going to go from us learning on sticks. And by the way, I feel confident my great grandparents were like, we rode a donkey. That's what
right.
That's what we had.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. There was so much more that I wanted us to cover, but I also want to be respectful of time. I know I promised we'd be out of here by about 1:45. And so, friends, this should not be the last time you interact with Andrew's book, The Ethical Imperative. I will share with you, one of the things I love about having a podcast, friends, is I actually got a preview copy because it gets released tomorrow, the day after we record this conversation. But this conversation is not going to be put on our podcast feed for a few weeks. So by the time you hear it, The Ethical Imperative is out. So go to Amazon or your favorite bookstore. I also have a feeling this is probably one of those books you'll be able to find in the airport because it's going to be a really good book. Or if you happen to find yourself in an airport, you can pick up a copy of Andrew Cooper's The Ethical Imperative. Now, Andrew also mentioned in Two Truths and a Lie that he's got a small business. And so I want to make sure that you know how you can find out more about that business. So you can learn more about his impactful work at andrew-cooper.com. That dash is a hyphen. That's andrew-cooper.com. And of course, I'm going to link to both of those in our show notes. Hey, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Dolph. I really appreciate you having me.
All right, friends, once again, if you missed either of those two links, you can go to Amazon, but we're going to link to it in the show notes, and also andrew-cooper.com. We're going to link to both of those in our show notes at successfulnonprofits.com. And if you found this episode useful, if it scratched that need that you've been having about how you can have some conversations with funders or ways in which you can be a more ethical leader that's very authentic in being ethical, there's two other episodes I'd like for you to consider. The first is Embrace the Challenge, Empowering Leaders with Luis Velasquez and Kristen Gleitzman. That's episode 307. The second is a montage episode, 17 leadership books to add to your reading list. And just in case you don't remember, our montage episodes are ones where prior guests tell us what their favorite leadership book is. So make sure you check that one out as well. That, my friend, is our show for the week. I hope that you have gained some insight to help you and your nonprofit thrive. And of course, I wouldn't do it, but the lawyers make me. I might say bad things about lawyers, but I'm married to one, and we just had a lawyer on this past episode. So here's the disclaimer. I'm neither an accountant nor an attorney, and neither I nor the consulting practice provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. If that's what you need, please find a licensed, qualified professional in your area and get the support you need.